for the keynote speech and also moderate the keynote speech today. So Kun Yuan, please say something to our keynote speech today.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Tom, for his kind introduction and invitation. And good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be the moderator of this keynote session at the ACBES 2021. Welcome all of you to this session, where we are honored to have Professor Alon to be the keynote speaker. And before the start of the session, just please allow me to briefly introduce Professor Alon. Ilan is a professor of strategy and international marketing at the School of Business and Law at the University of Agder. He holds a PhD from Kent State University in the US. He is the researcher in the field of international business with a focus on internationalization, modes of entry, political risk, cultural intelligence, and emerging markets. His publications have appeared in many internationally renowned journals. His books are published by many international press as well. He's also the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Emerging Markets and the European Journal of International Management. Those are the SSCI ranked journals. Today, he will bring us a keynote speech on the globalization of Chinese capital, theory, practice, and policy. After the session, there will be a Q&A session. So during the speech, could I ask every participant to be muted? At the same time, please feel free to leave your question in the chat box of the Zoom if there's any. Alternatively, you will also have the opportunity to ask questions to Professor Alon after his speech during the Q&A session. So, okay, now I will hand over the following time to our keynote speaker, Professor Alon. So please.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. Can you all see my slides projected?
Yes.
And can you see it moving now?
Yeah, excellent.
Super. So let's get started. It's a pleasure to speak at this conference. I see that many of the speakers, many of the papers have dealt with financial and business flows. And the emergence of China to the world economy that started really in earnest only about 20 years ago has really was a game changer on several levels. First of all, on the geopolitical level, at the highest level, this was the first challenge to the American hegemonic power since the Soviet Union, and created kind of a world that has two world powers again, and a situation that at the national level suggests that countries have to, unfortunately right now, choose between the United States and China in terms of international alliances. At the national level, should governments, should localities invite Chinese investors, and what are the consequences of these new internationalizing firms? At the firm level, we might think about the Chinese firm really challenging many of our basic management theories, because it's not very clear that many of the assumptions associated with the firm's internationalization, even the reason for being, are the same in the West as they are in the East. Today, I will talk to you a little bit about the policy issues, theoretical issues, and practical issues surrounding the globalization of Chinese enterprises. And my talk comes from a point of studying China for the last 20 years, writing several books about China, and editing the International Journal of Emerging Markets. In addition, we do an annual conference on China. It's called China Goes Global, and we've been doing that since 2006. And I have had a chance to study the Chinese language and to teach in various Chinese universities. So I come with a unique perspective based on my experiences and my research background. As I said, our beginning in most of the research up to the year 2000 was about how to enter China, how to take advantage of the billion plus people and the consumers that they represent. But since the 2000, we started a new research agenda, which is how do Chinese companies go abroad and how they should be treated in other countries. So this is something that is ongoing, and you can take a look at this website and see the kind of research and fora that we provide. So as promised, we're going to talk about the practice, the theory and the policy. The practice is that China is already among the world's largest investors, but it is a mix of political, economic, and developmental objectives as China expands its global outreach to Latin America and to Africa and uses instruments such as the Belt and Road Initiative. It actually changes many of the value-added activities as well as the relationships that they have with other countries vis-a-vis other world powers. On the theory front, it's a good testing ground for the generalizability of things like the foreign direct investment theories. And because it's a nascent phenomenon, we could see that there is different path to internationalization that challenges the assumption of traditional theories. So I will discuss with you a little bit the theories, the traditional theories, and what the problems are with them. But then I will also talk to you about the opportunities to create new theories. And I will present to you a paper that I recently published called the Learning Portal Model. And then on the policy front, does China's state capitalism governance, how does that different? And what kind of business configurations come around this new combination of autocratic government with capitalistic markets? Of course, we also have the differentiation between the rule of law on the one hand, which is practiced in the West, and the rule by law, which is practiced in China. I will differentiate between these two and give you some examples. The US and China are going through kind of a divorce process now in the post-COVID reset, and a kind of a technological nationalism is starting to develop around it, and we can discuss that perhaps in the Q&A in more detail as well. China has the choice to either join the international institutions that are in place, i.e. the World Trade Organization, World Bank, IMF, and others, which they already take part in and try to influence them from within, but that's where the United States has the upper hand, or create its own institutions. For example, the BRI, AIIB, and China 2025 Horizon. So some statistics, I think you all know, the numbers are going up in China on almost everything, including outward foreign direct investment. But the interesting thing, if you look at this, and if you look at these flows, you could see that Hong Kong, which is really part of China, is getting the majority of this investment. So what we don't really know is where does it really go from there? Because of Hong Kong and the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands, they get more foreign direct investment than even the largest economy in the world, the United States. So the question then is what to do with them empirically. How do we handle these offshore financial centers? Bermuda included. Notice here is also Macau. So the problem is that if we ignore it and we take it out of our regression analyses, then we will actually get a very biased set of results. And if we include it, but then actually the final destination of the foreign direct investment to Hong Kong, Cayman Islands, and Bermuda is elsewhere, we also get erroneous and biased results. So as a result, we actually surveyed many of the papers that were written about foreign direct investment from China, and we found that they don't handle these issues. They either don't tell the readers, or they do something and they keep us questioning the validity of the data. And this is something that Sutherland and Anderson have actually discussed in the China Journal. And I think it's a kind of a very thoughtful piece that talks about the role of offshore financial centers in distorting data coming out of China. Not to mention the fact that even data directly from the government, like the MOFCOM data, doesn't include reinvestment data. So much of the empirical research on Chinese foreign direct investment, unfortunately, is a bunch of garbage in, garbage out regression analyses. This is also coupled by this Chinese saying that the officials make the numbers and the numbers make the officials. So there is also a kind of a tendency of local officials to meet their economic goals, their economic numbers, and to produce at almost any cost the kind of numbers that the central government is looking for. So yet again, when we're looking at numbers, how much of that is distorted by the political process in China? Well, let's talk a little bit about the theories. In terms of the theories, my first book on the globalization of Chinese enterprises was published by Palgrave, and in there we were summarizing the state of knowledge of all the different things that Chinese investors are doing around the world. And what we have observed as we have researched these firms is that many of them actually do not follow the traditional Western theoretical approach that we would expect out of the Uppsala model, or out of the internalization model, or out of the OLI model. So in a sense, what we found that, and we thought about, is that the context of China is so different that new theories altogether are needed. So in a sense, this was a kind of a breakthrough for us, because we realized that there's an opportunity here to really augment or develop new theories, and this is kind of got the process going in this direction. But at that time, Alan Rugman, who since died, has reviewed my book. He was a very big, influential author, and he said, no, that's nonsense, because everything can be explained through my model, the Rugman 2x2, let's say, model of internationalization. And he said, look, most countries and firms divide into these 4 quadrants. And if we think about the United States is a country that has strong country-specific advantages, strong firm-specific advantages, a strong country with strong firms. And those firms have certain advantages technologically, and they are allowed to, they're capable of exploiting these internal capabilities in order to, let's say, take advantage of the markets in weaker countries with weaker firms. I mean, who can really compete with Coca-Cola and with Nike and with Microsoft and many of these firms from these strong countries? Well, India, if we contrast it, is a country that has a few strong firms with strong technical advantages, but on the other side, a country that is struggling with governance, that is struggling with economic growth, struggling with political instability. And as a result, India is a country, therefore, that belongs in the quadrant of strong country advantages and weak firm advantages, and its internationalization will be very different. Now, looking at China, it's quite the opposite. The country is strong, but many of its firms are actually struggling in terms of having the basic capabilities assumed in the firm, in the models of the firm from the West. It doesn't have brands, it doesn't have superior technology, and therefore it will internationalize in a different way. However, what this model doesn't do, it doesn't give us the process, okay? How different the internationalization of the country-specific, firm-specific configurations, what would be the process? And this is kind of what I started to focus on. So on the one hand, China has really strong country-specific advantages, especially if you think about the government support and the political stability and economic growth. But on the other hand, the country is also suffering from these same country-specific advantages when firms from China go to countries in the West. For example, Huawei is a good example of a firm that has very strong support, good technical skills, but struggles exactly because it's inseparable. The country-specific and the firm-specific advantages are intermingled in the case of Huawei, and therefore it creates a political adverse reaction against Huawei on the political front of Western countries. So this is something that Child and Marinova have discovered in 2014, that it's not only where you're going to and what is the context of internationalization, but also where you're coming from. And if you kind of divided countries in terms of political stability and institutional maturity, then you would say that, the United States is high on both, but China, while politically stable with a strong communist government, its governance is still in the process of developing, and therefore it's less mature than its Western counterparts. So therefore, if you come from country A versus country B, and you're going to country D, let's say sub-Saharan Africa, where political and institutional immaturity, then those processes and the relationships, the kind of dyadic relationships, will therefore be affected by these dynamics. So this actually was very important, because understanding that the China sub-Saharan or China, the United States, it even matters whether the US firm goes to China or when the Chinese firms goes to the US. So it's not even symmetrical in terms of the effect of where you're coming from. So this started to get us thinking about, well, where is the literature altogether if we analyze it on the Chinese enterprise going global? And what we saw is that there are four major type of research agenda. One is should firms go overseas? Second is, what are the drivers and motivations? Third is, what the location choices? And fourth is, what are the entry modes? And when we summarize the hundreds of different articles, we laid out a model that looks at it at three levels: at the country level, at the industry level, at the firm level. And at the country level, it has two dimensions, as I mentioned before: the host country factors and the home country factors. Now, what is actually different, if you look at this holistically, between Chinese firm and the, let's say, American and European multinationals, is the role of the government. Note that the role of government is embedded in the FDI policy, in the government ownership, in the government policy in the case of China, in the industry policy in the case of China. For example, the telecommunication sector will very much follow the 5-year plans that the government puts in place. And of course, in the kind of the home country ties that China has developed in government to government relationships. So from the very micro to the very macro are strong political influences, government-related factors that blur the difference between what is the firm and where does the firm end and the government begin in the case of China. So it is a new kind of a political economic system that is different from what we have seen previously, either in the United States or in the Soviet Union. So the traditional theories are lacking in that they are actually based on the wrong assumptions. And some new theories have started to develop, and I will talk to you about the last one in most detail because it's mine, and I will explain to you what the advantages of using that particular theory. But here is the classical model of Uppsala, and it says that countries and companies internationalize by going from, let's say, exports to agents to subsidiaries and finally to production abroad. And on the other hand, they will start going from countries that are near to them with similar institutional structure, language, economic development, and then they will eventually go to faraway places. So if you look at the internationalization of, let's say, European companies, they first go to other European countries, and maybe down the road, as they develop some skills, they will go to China or India or Vietnam. But in fact, what we see in China is very different, right? There's a jump. It goes directly from the countries that are very different, and it goes directly to production and investment. So it actually leapfrogs the the kind of progress that Western companies made. The second thing is, a lot of times we assume that the company has a very strong ownership advantage, a particular technology, a brand, right? And in case, if they don't have it, we usually say the textbook style explanation to our students, we say, stay home, develop your skills. No, the Chinese are saying, we don't need that. We could buy those ownership advantages abroad, or we can expropriate it through a variety of mechanisms I can discuss with you later. And then the second part is the location-specific advantage oftentimes is not available for outsiders in China as it is for insiders. So in other words, the Chinese firm is advantaged by a government policy that favors the Chinese firm over the foreign firm in terms of, let's say, big government contracts, in terms of direct help, okay, and in many other ways. So you see these models of internalization, of OLI, are actually not consistent with the observed reality. And note that no matter what form of entry you use, ownership advantage is a kind of a prerequisite to the internationalization of the firm. So the assumption is that, number one, you have country-specific advantage, but of course the global context is different now, because the firms from East Asia, Taiwan, Japan, and others after World War II had 20, 30 years to develop. The firms in China want to leapfrog the process. They sometimes leverage the home country advantage, for example, low labor rates, in order to capture foreign markets in exports, for example. Internally, they don't have ownership advantages, but they could buy it, and they could buy it as a signal, and they could buy it in order to bring it back home. So they do have some new processes and new models. For example, Alibaba and Tencent and Didi and others, some of them were taken and combined with different business models from the West. Which leads to our question is whether we actually need a new theory of the globalization of Chinese firms, or do we need a Chinese theory of globalization of firms? And this is something that we have kind of struggled with, and we believe that there is an approach and an ability to contribute in both directions. And we looked at a particular theory that is called the Springboarding Perspective. And what it suggests is that Chinese firms motivated by getting assets like ownership advantages, like technologies, are uniquely challenged by poor corporate governance and lack of global experience. But what they do have a lot of experience is receiving foreign direct investment from the West throughout the 80s and the 90s, and capturing some of those value-added activities, for example, in manufacturing, and developing specific skills in those areas so they can move up the value chain towards brands, using the government help, using the help of offshore financial centers, using the help of entrepreneurial leadership. They compensate for the competitive disadvantage by bypassing institutional barriers domestically and iteratively capturing more of these knowledge over time and leapfrogging the process that is suggested by the Uppsala model, for example. So it's something like this. It starts with firms come to China and invest in a particular industry. This leads to quick learning and a radical investment of Chinese firms abroad in order to transfer that capabilities at home. So a firm invests in China, let's maybe buy this firm, or let's buy a firm like it and try to do that. This means that you have a home-centered capability upgrading, followed by kind of a global catapulation to global markets and a capture of global markets. And if you look at many of the Chinese business leaders and companies, they follow that model. The problem with the springboarding perspective is that it doesn't tell us how and where the use of these assets and how you combine, as from the traditional theory, the country-specific and firm-specific advantages. and what modes of entry are used for learning. And this is where our theory comes in, because it assumes that learning happens through radical foreign direct investment, right? Making a big investment and trying it out. So how do these firms actually overcome the firm-specific disadvantages? That is the lack of technology, the lack of brands. And what we suggest is that there's different portals. We looked at various companies simultaneously in the automobile industry over time. We interviewed and did some qualitative work on it. And what we found is that there is a kind of a four-step process. Number one, you establish a learning portal via foreign direct investment and exports. In other words, both platforms can be used for learning. One to learn about markets and one to learn about basic technologies, let's say research and development. So these two portals of learning are then used to transfer knowledge and technology back into the home market, because the biggest consumer market for almost anything in terms of growth and in terms of total value is oftentimes in China itself. So to be competitive with the foreign firms, these portals are used to bring these technologies in and to exploit them in the combined advantages in first in emerging markets by selling to emerging markets, but eventually by combining the advantages and the know-how, both of developing and developed countries, to capture advanced market portions of various industry. In other words, they go both, they internalize both upstream towards the R&D and knowledge, and downstream into market knowledge. And the modes that they use are simultaneously, at least in the downstream, exports, and in the upstream direct investment. So if we looked at it more holistically, the Chinese firms use learning opportunities at every level of investment, and use this as a kind of in an iterative process to develop capabilities that will enable them to be global competitors. And today we could see that more and more of these firms have reached the kind of the top 1,000 firms from China, not just from China, from the entire world. So if we summarize it, if the contemporary Uppsala model suggests that there is a kind of a linear process, and the springboarding suggests that there's a kind of a leapfrogging process, our learning model suggests that both processes in the Chinese firm happen simultaneously, which allows it to reach global competitiveness much faster than their East Asian counterparts. So if we look at it in terms of exploration and exploitation, the firms can use it both from a location-bound perspective and from a non-location bound perspective, i.e. the basic technologies acquired through the internationalization process. A good example of that, I live in Norway, which is a kind of a leading country, let's say, with the highest country-specific experience with electric vehicles. And you could see that the XPeng has just entered to try to compete with Tesla head-to-head. Now, will they sell more than Tesla in Norway? No way. But will they learn how to compete with Tesla? And the answer is absolutely. They will learn what their weaknesses are, and they will be able to improve them first for the Chinese market, and eventually for other emerging markets like Vietnam, and finally in the Norwegian market, which is the most advanced EV market in the world. There is a difference in how firms use greenfield versus mergers and acquisition. And in the case of China, what we found is that in corrupt countries, in risky countries, they actually end up using more greenfield until they make the relationships, and then eventually they go into mergers and acquisitions. Now, why is that? Because these two systems of relation-based versus rule-based systems allow different level of control of the subsidiary. And in most developing countries, including in China, there are relation-based governance. That is, people you know, right? They create person-specific relationships, perhaps with government people, perhaps with other industry players. But what a lot of times the institutional distance literature misspecified is that similar institutions, for example, just because China has relation-based governance, that it will also work in India because they're also relation-based governance. And the answer is no, because relations are not transferable. And that's the whole point of relation-based governance. Now, what might be transferable is the ability to create a relationship, but even that may not be transferable. And by the way, that's why the global trading system is based on rules rather than on relationships, right? So the greenfield investments are preferred where institutions are more relation-based. But when you get experience, at least the Chinese firm that we've observed in the empirical data, the more experience they have in a country, the more relationships they build within a country, even when it's a corrupt one, the more likely they are to also engage in mergers and acquisitions. So this is about the firm. What about the policy? Well, we looked at firms from China going to very risky countries, to Iran, to Africa, and we asked ourselves, do they understand country risk? Aren't they afraid of these countries' institutional environment? Or are they naive because they don't have experience? And what we actually found in our paper is that actually Chinese firms have a lot of thought. They put a lot of thought about the political risk process. And they are very purposeful, at least the top 100 firms, by the way, all of them are government owned, are actually thoughtful and cognizant of the influence of politics on their business. But what we have observed empirically is the largest investments happen in the least developed country and the most developed countries. And what you could see in the least developed countries, like North Korea and Venezuela and Angola and Liberia, they're government-to-government relationships. So the relationship-based process is in play, whereas in the very developed countries like Luxembourg or Cyprus, they either use it as an offshore financial center, in which funds then travel perhaps to Germany or to the United States or they use it as a kind of a platform for R&D takeover. And what we found is that the intellectual property practices of Chinese firms are kind of disadvantage the foreign player because the Chinese demand the rule of law in places like Canada and the United States, but rule through law at home, creating a differential advantage in the global level, since China is such a big market, to the Chinese firms. And one example of that we have written about is the China Belt and Road Initiative. And in this example, you could see that China developed very strong country-specific links to particular industries that will benefit from this global initiative, one road, one circle, one sky. And the relationships that they form, again, challenge the global value-added chain, as recently was reviewed by Peter Buckley in JIBS relating to my book. Now, in this, he outlines, and I'm not going to review it here for the lack of time, a research agenda relating to international business and the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think is well worth reading and thinking about if you're studying international trade and international business flows. We also saw and observed in our research, in our recent research, is that Chinese, at least as it comes to Africa, are more likely to invest in corrupt places, and they're more likely to invest in these fragile institutions when the Belt and Road Initiative is in place. So the Belt and Road Initiative enables investment in the least developed and perhaps most corrupt nations in the world, promoting, perhaps enabling their leaders to stay in power. And we saw that again and again in another research that we're doing, where we saw that bad governance doesn't deter investment. And in fact, if it's coupled with foreign aid, actually increases investment in those areas. And one of the challenges that countries around the world now have, including Vietnam, is what to choose. Do we go with the US or the Chinese worldview, rule of law, international institutions, a challenge, I think, to balance these two economic systems simultaneously for most countries. And where we see that play out most is in two books we recently edited, is in the case of firms like Huawei, which are developing basic telecommunication infrastructure, and where the risk of a Trojan horse entering the telecommunication system has been highlighted with the links to the Chinese government. What are the research implications here? Institutional change is not one way. What are the boundaries of the firm? Is Huawei a privately owned firm? What is the role of the government? A degree of independence. China's global expansion. Does Chinese firms subsidiaries or departments of the government? The issues of institutional duality, where you have two different institutions in China and in the developed world when it comes to international trade and international business and the multinational firm. And of course, cultural change in China, the constant changing role of the state. We see that now under Xi Jinping, and we could see that that's probably gonna continue to occupy us for years to come. So I leave you here for opening up the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Kun Yuan, are you here? So maybe he got some problem with